And we'll move to the next talk by Anna Gausen. Anna, you can share your screen, which is entitled, Can we stop fake news using agent-based modeling to evaluate countermeasure for misinformation on social media?
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
All right.
Stage is yours.
Give me one sec. All right, hello. So my name is Anna Gausen. I'm a PhD student at Imperial College, and today I'll be presenting my research paper entitled Can we stop fake news? Using agent-based modeling to evaluate countermeasures for misinformation on social media. So before I launch into it, I just want to provide a bit of an overview of my presentation. First, I'll give some background to the paper, then our approach, including a description of our agent-based model, and then outline our experimental results, leaving some time, hopefully at the end, for some questions. So, as mentioned earlier, my paper is entitled, Can we stop fake news? Which, in a way, is what everyone here is working towards. So I'm going to start the presentation by introducing this problem I'm trying to tackle, which is misinformation on social media. So the scale of social media platforms is unprecedented. Facebook was recorded to have 2.7 billion monthly active users in 2020. And with this has come unprecedented volumes of data. These platforms have transformed the way in which we communicate and seek information. They're increasingly used as a primary source of information on political, social, and environmental issues. This has undermined trust in traditional media, public institutions, and science, resulting in what has been called an infodemic of misinformation. Misinformation has impacted democratic elections, it's caused conflict, and as we've seen repeatedly over the pandemic, it's jeopardized public health. As a result, platforms are increasingly under pressure to moderate their content, and there's a growing area of research into misinformation countermeasures. So misinformation countermeasures are policies that are employed to try to reduce the spread or impact of misinformation. Misinformation is shown to be sticky, meaning that once people are exposed to it and believe it, it becomes very difficult to change this. So my paper is focused on evaluating behavioural interventions which try to stop people believing that misinformation in the first place and comparing them to a standard approach of blocking users. So the two behavioural countermeasures we explore are societal inoculation, which uses inoculation warnings and pre-bunking to build up mental antibodies, and accuracy fags, which improve the information users share by shifting their attention to accuracy, which Mo-san actually spoke about earlier this afternoon. Due to the complex nature of the propagation of information on social networks, it can be very difficult to predict the impact of misinformation countermeasures. The behavioural experiments, some of which we've seen today, are really useful for providing some insight into the effectiveness of countermeasures. However, due to their scale, they can't predict the full impact when the countermeasure is implemented on a full-scale network. So this leads nicely onto the focus of our paper. So we developed an agent-based model of a social media network which can be used to evaluate and compare the effect of different misinformation countermeasures on a full-scale network. So agent-based models describe complex systems as collections of agents which have simplistic behaviours at an agent level. And when these agents combine or interact, they can exhibit more complex behaviour at the macro level, also known as emergent behaviour. From a review of related work, our model is the first empirically validated agent-based model of the spread of misinformation on social media with the ability to evaluate countermeasures. So this approach has these two contributions. So first, an agent-based model that can evaluate the impact of misinformation countermeasures on both true and fake news stories. And secondly, we calibrated and validated the model using real Twitter data about COVID-19. So the proposed model is inspired by epidemic modelling and it has 4 agent states: susceptible, believes, denies, and cured. The model is based on a Twitter-like network, and in the model, the agents who represent social media users can share information with their neighbours or followers representative of tweeting. So the model is initialized with a subgroup of agents, believers, who tweet the misinformation. At each time step, some of the followers will see the tweet and be influenced by its content. This will result in them either retweeting it as a sign of agreement and passing on the information, tweeting an opposing view, becoming a denier, or remaining susceptible and not tweeting on the subject. The probabilities of each of these outcomes are sampled from a probability distribution that's calibrated with real Twitter data. At each time step, The believers and the deniers will try to convince their followers of the information they're sharing, and this cycle continues for the duration of the simulation. So the proposed model I just described is first run with no countermeasures to provide a baseline, and then the countermeasures are implemented independently and the output is compared to the baseline to evaluate their impact. This slide describes the implementation of each countermeasure. So blocking users is implemented by introducing an additional agent state, blocked, and an agent attribute which counts the number of complaints against that agent. When the number of complaints exceeds the limit, the user is blocked. Societal inoculation increases an individual's resistance to misinformation. So in terms of the model, this means the user is less likely to become infected or believe the misinformation. Accuracy prompts increase the likelihood that a user correctly assesses whether or not a piece of information is accurate, therefore increasing the likelihood of becoming vaccinated or skeptical of the misinformation. And the amount in which we vary the probability of infection or vaccination for the information were taken from findings from the 2 behavioural experiments, which I have cited on the slide. So now I'm going to talk through our experimental setup and our preliminary results. So for this research, 2 experiments were run to evaluate and compare the impact of the 3 countermeasures. So the proposed model was run without countermeasures and then run with each countermeasure independently. And these are based on the propagation on Twitter of a true and a fake news story related to the current COVID-19 pandemic. In the interest of time, I'm not going to provide details on the data calibration and validation of the model, which I've outlined on the slide, but please ask questions at the end if you're interested. Before I continue to the results, it's just important to note that agent-based models are really useful for providing insight into the comparison of different policies, but they don't provide exact predictions just due to their inbuilt assumptions. So this should guide how the results are interpreted. So what did we find? So here we can see the experimental results for the case study of a fake news story, which was China stole coronavirus from Canada and weaponized it into a bioweapon. So the black line shows the propagation of the story from the real Twitter dataset. The red line shows the propagation with no countermeasures from the simulation, and the blue line shows the propagation of the story with the countermeasure applied to the baseline. If we look at the graph, the results indicate that all the countermeasures would be effective in reducing the spread of the story. And based on these results, inoculation is shown to be the most effective with a 36% reduction on average. However, its performance is very similar to blocking users within 3%, making it difficult to confidently evaluate which would be most effective. Now, if we continue to look at the next set of graphs, which show the impact of the countermeasure on the true news story, this provides quite interesting insight. So it shows that blocking users limits the spread of true news twice as much as inoculation. This indicates, based on these implementations, that the behavioural countermeasures, particularly inoculation, would be the most effective in minimising the spread of misinformation whilst having the least impact on the spread of truthful information. And this is an important balance for social media platforms to achieve, as their functionality shouldn't be hindered by these countermeasures. So to conclude, the phenomenon of online misinformation poses one of the biggest challenges of the coming decade. Mitigating the impact of misinformation on social media is essential to foster democratic debate and promote access to trustworthy news, as I think everyone's echoed today. This research shows that agent-based models of social media networks could be a useful tool for evaluating countermeasures for misinformation. Based on the chosen case studies and countermeasures, the experimental results show that though societal inoculation and blocking users had a similar impact in reducing the spread of fake news, for the true news story, blocking users resulted in reducing the spread twice as much as inoculation, which wouldn't be desirable as it would hinder the platform's functionality. So, in summary, these preliminary results indicate that agent-based models could allow policymakers to test the impact of proposed countermeasures on both true and fake news before implementing them on a live social media platform. So while these results are interesting, it's important to caveat them by making it clear that the model I presented today has a number of assumptions and limitations, such as the number of case studies and agent behaviour. On the slide, you can see 3 suggested directions for future work. So firstly, more research is required into the validation and verification of agent-based models so they can be trusted to inform policy making. Secondly, increased complexity in agent behaviour would enhance the model's ability to capture the real behaviour of social media users. And finally, the simulations presented only had 10,000 agents, which isn't realistic, so computation acceleration would be required to run non-trivial population sizes. Hopefully, this suggested future work would help this approach reach its full potential. As they say, research is never finished. I'd like to conclude my talk by saying thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I hope you found it interesting, and I invite any questions.